The second glass of champagne was a mistake. The fourth was a decision. By the time I lost count, I had stopped deciding anything at all. And that was how Cassia Calloway found me. Folded against the wall of her own hallway, mascara in ruins, my heels somewhere I would never see again, whispering apologies to a potted fern I had apparently knocked sideways. My name is Marlo Vance. I was 24 years old, an omega, $5,000 behind on a surgery I had already promised to pay for, and until approximately 11 minutes earlier, a guest at my best friend's birthday party who had sworn to herself she would have one drink and leave early. I had presented at 16 in a school bathroom with my hand pressed over my own mouth so no one would hear me cry, and I had spent every year since learning how to be quiet about the rest of it too. Quiet about the bills. Quiet about my brother Eli's heart, which skipped in ways it should not skip. Quiet about the numbers I saw in my sleep, rows and columns nobody else in the room could read like sentences. That last part was the only interesting thing about me. I did the books for a bakery on 9th Street for cash under the table, and I did them the way other people play piano, without thinking. The way a pattern either sits right or it doesn't. The way a wrong number sends a small cold shock up through my teeth before I even know why. Nobody at Josie Calloway's birthday party knew that about me. Nobody at Josie Calloway's birthday party knew much about me at all, other than that I was the roommate from freshman year who still came around, who brought a $6 bottle of wine to parties thrown in penthouses, who laughed a beat too late at jokes that assumed a childhood I hadn't had. Josie's older sister owned the penthouse. Everyone called her the Winter Ledger, and not to her face. I had heard the name 100 times before I ever saw the woman attached to it, in bored write-ups Josie left open on her laptop, in the hushed, admiring dread of interns who'd been in the same elevator as her for 4 floors and lived to describe it. Cassia Calloway ran Calloway Holdings the way a surgeon runs an operating room, sealed, silent, and merciless to anyone who introduced infection. She had taken a shipping company her father lost and rebuilt it into something with tentacles in freight and finance and half a dozen things I only understood because I read annual reports for fun, which Josie said was, and I quote, deeply concerning. Cassia never came to Josie's parties. That was the rule. Josie had told me so at least 4 times, fondly, the way you describe a weather pattern. She came to this one for 11 minutes, and I ruined every one of them. The room tipped when I stood up. It wasn't the champagne alone. I hadn't eaten since noon, hadn't slept properly since the surgeon's office called with a new number, a bigger number, and I had smiled at the receptionist like the smile itself might close the gap. I made it as far as the hallway before my body simply declined to continue the performance. I remember the wallpaper. I remember thinking it cost more than my rent. I remember sliding down it anyway, because gravity does not care what wallpaper costs. And then there was a shadow that smelled like wet slate and clove smoke, crouching in front of me without touching me first. "Look at me," she said, not unkind. Not kind either. A command, delivered the way you'd set down a scalpel, with total confidence that it would be obeyed. I looked at her. I would like to say I remember thinking she was beautiful, and she was, but what I actually thought, with the particular honesty of the extremely drunk, was that she looked like a woman who had never once in her life fallen down a hallway. "How much have you had?" she said. Not a question. A diagnostic. "Enough," I said, with the tragic dignity of someone whose head had just tipped sideways against the wallpaper again. Something crossed her face that might have been the beginning of a smile, and thought better of it. Josie's friend. "Marlo," I said. "I do numbers. For a bakery." I have no idea, to this day, why that felt like the most important information I could give a stranger while sliding down her wall, except that it was the one true thing I had. She didn't laugh at me. That was the first thing I noticed that I would keep noticing, over and over, for the rest of the story I am telling you now. She did not laugh at me. Not once. Not when I deserved it, and not when I didn't. She got an arm under mine like she was moving cargo she'd already calculated the weight of, efficient and sure, and walked me down a hall lined with photographs of a woman who looked like her but colder, and a man who looked like nobody at all, because grief does that to faces in pictures. It erases the person who's still there to remember them. "Guest rooms flooded," she said, when I made a noise about being taken somewhere. "Pipe, contractors coming Thursday." A pause, weighed like everything else about her was weighed. "You're sleeping in my bed tonight." I want to tell you I said something devastating back. I said, "Okay," and then I said, "Sorry about your fern," and then I was asleep before she'd finished pulling the blanket over me, in a bed that smelled like clove smoke and rain on stone, in an apartment that cost more than the rest of my life combined, next to a woman the business papers called a glacier. I did not know yet that she'd slept in a chair by the door. I would find that out later, the way I found out most things about Cassia Calloway, Sideways, and Too Late to Pretend It Didn't Matter. I woke at 6 with a headache like a verdict, and the specific whole-body horror of remembering exactly how many mistakes I had made in one night. The room was pale gray with early light. She was still in the chair, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the forearm, reading something on a tablet like she hadn't spent the night guarding a drunk stranger instead of sleeping in her own bed. "There's water on the nightstand," she said without looking up. "And aspirin. Take both before you apologize, because you're going to want to apologize, and I'd rather you weren't in pain while you do it badly." I laughed before I could stop myself. It hurt my skull. It was worth it. "I'm sorry," I said anyway, badly, exactly as predicted. "I don't usually. This isn't. I know what it usually isn't." She set the tablet down. Her eyes were a color I would spend the next several months trying and failing to name to myself. Not gray, not green, something that changed with the light the way deep water does. "You said you do numbers for a bakery." "Sourdough Sisters." On 9th. I know it. Of course she did. She probably owned the building. You didn't say for how long or for how much, which tells me it's not enough of either. It wasn't a question, so I didn't answer it, and she didn't wait for one. "Josie's asleep until noon most Sundays. There's coffee in the kitchen, and a car downstairs whenever you're ready. No conversation required if you'd rather not have one." I remember thinking, foolishly, that this was the kindest thing anyone had done for me in over a year, and that I was furious about how much it cost me to notice. I took the car. I did not take the silence. Some traitor part of me asked, halfway to the elevator, what her name even was for. The epithet everyone whispered, and she'd looked at me for one long second like she was deciding whether the question deserved an answer. "People call me the Winter Ledger," she said. "I've never corrected them. Why not?" "Because it's useful to be feared. The elevator doors opened. It's less useful to be known." I did not see her again for 3 weeks. I thought about her more than that. The reason I saw her again was Weston Hale, though I did not know his name yet, and would not have cared if I had, because on the Tuesday that changed everything, I was only thinking about Eli. My brother was 17 and had a heart that had been misfiring since he was 9. A birth defect nobody had caught until he collapsed at a school assembly, and the diagnosis came down like a verdict nobody appeals. The surgery that would fix it, actually fix it, not manage it, not delay it, cost more than our mother had left us when she died. More than I made in 2 years doing books for a bakery and tutoring statistics on the weekends and picking up night shifts wherever a body that didn't need much sleep could be useful. I had pawned everything I could bear to pawn. The last thing left was my grandmother's brooch, a small garnet thing shaped like a sprig of holly, and I had promised myself I would not touch it, and on that Tuesday I touched it anyway, because Eli's surgeon's office had called with a deposit deadline, and deadlines do not care about promises. I was standing in the pawn shop with the brooch in my palm when Josie called. Breathless, saying her sister needed someone who could read numbers faster than her entire accounting department. Today. Right now. An emergency audit before a board meeting Thursday. And did I know anyone? And I laughed and said I knew exactly one person. And Josie said, "Wait, you?" In a tone that told me precisely how invisible I had been to everyone in that family except the one who mattered. I put the brooch back in my pocket instead of the pawnbroker's tray. I did not know yet that I would need to pawn it again before this was over. Callaway Tower had 60 floors of glass and money, and my reflection in the elevator tried and failed to look like it belonged there. It didn't. Neither did I. Not in the blazer I'd borrowed from Josie. Not in the shoes that pinched. Not in the way the security guard's eyes flicked over me and recalculated my worth in half a second and got it wrong. Cassia was waiting on the executive floor, and for one unguarded moment before she saw me, I watched her rub her thumb hard across her palm, a small, private gesture, the only crack I would ever see in the glass before I understood what put it there. "You're late," she said, once she did see me. "Traffic," I said, and I had to pawn a brooch. I don't know why I told her that. Maybe because she was the kind of person who made honesty feel like the only currency that would clear. Something in her face changed, not softened exactly, but recalibrated, like she'd been handed a data point that didn't fit her model of the world and had decided to keep it rather than discard it. "The numbers are in here," she said, and led me into a glass office with a view that made my stomach drop for reasons that had nothing to do with height, and set 3 years of quarterly filings in front of me like a dare. "Every accountant I employ says these are clean. I don't believe them. Why not? Because my father died believing his numbers were clean too." I did not ask what she meant. I would learn it in pieces, over months, the way you learn a house by living in it instead of touring it. What I did instead was sit down, roll up my sleeves, and read. I found the first discrepancy in 11 minutes, a transfer routed through a Shell logistics vendor, dated the same week every quarter for 3 years, small enough to hide in rounding, consistent enough to be a pattern instead of an accident. I did not say anything at first. I just felt the cold shock climb my teeth, the one that meant a number was lying to me, and I kept reading, and I found 6 more. "Someone's been skimming," I said finally. Small and old. Older than the Shell vendor. This isn't new theft dressed up. This is somebody finishing something they started a long time ago. Cassia went very still. Not frightened still. Predator still. "Show me," she said. And I did. And for the next 4 hours, the most powerful woman I had ever met sat beside me at a conference table while I walked her line by line through evidence that someone inside her own company had been bleeding it slowly since before I'd even met her. Her scent changed while I talked. The clove smoke edge sharpened, went colder, like rain turning to sleet, and I understood without being told that I was watching Fury with its collar on. "His name is Weston Hale," she said, when I finally circled back far enough to find the account's origin point. "He was my father's partner. He convinced my father to leverage everything the year before the market turned, took the insurance payout when it collapsed, and let everyone believe my father did it to himself." Her jaw worked once. He's been my CFO for 6 years. I hired him myself. I thought keeping him close meant I could watch him. You couldn't watch a shell vendor filed under freight insurance, I said. Nobody could. That's not a failure. That's just what fraud is built to do. She looked at me the way you look at someone who has just handed you back something you thought you'd lost for good. Not gratitude exactly, something rawer. Stay, she said. Officially, I'll triple whatever the bakery pays you, and it still won't be enough. But stay. I said yes before I'd finished deciding to. I told myself it was for Eli's deposit. I have never entirely believed myself about that. The apartment they put me in, company housing. Cassia called it, though I would learn later she'd bought the building the week after I moved in, which was not company housing at all. It was simply hers. Was 3 subway stops and one entire universe from the one room walk-up Eli and I had shared with peeling paint and a radiator that clanked like a warning. There was a dishwasher. I had never lived anywhere with a dishwasher. I stood in the kitchen the first night and cried about a dishwasher, which tells you more about the year I'd had than anything else I could say. Cassia noticed things. That was the second thing I learned about her. After the fear versus known confession in the elevator, she noticed things and said nothing about most of them. And then, days later, the noticing would arrive in the form of an object. I mentioned once, in passing, that I missed the lemon cake from my mother's old bakery, the one that closed the year she died. 3 days later, there was a lemon cake on my counter, no note, and when I texted Josie to ask if she knew anything, Josie sent back a single laughing emoji and the words "she does this now," apparently, which was somehow funnier and sadder than either of us said out loud. I mentioned Eli's love of astronomy once, at a dinner I hadn't meant to attend, seated at a table with people whose watches cost more than my mother's funeral. A woman across the table, sleek, sweet-voiced, introduced as a family friend named Priscilla Vane. Though I would come to understand family friend meant something closer to a woman who had once expected to marry into this family and had never quite forgiven the world for changing its mind, looked at my borrowed dress and said, with a smile so warm it took me a full 3 seconds to feel the knife in it, "It's sweet that Cassia collects strays." She used to collect antiques instead, cheaper, and they don't talk back. The table went quiet, the specific quiet of people watching, to see if someone would bleed. "I don't talk back," I said. "I just correct the record. There's a difference, and you'd know it if you read footnotes." Cassia did not laugh, but her mouth did something at the corner that I would spend the rest of dinner replaying, and under the table, without looking at me. She moved her hand an inch closer to mine on the white cloth, not touching, just closer, a border redrawn. Later that week, a telescope arrived at our apartment addressed to Eli. No note. I called to say she shouldn't have, and she said, "I know," which was not an apology, and was somehow better than one. The first time she touched me, really touched me, not steadying an elbow, not an arm under mine in a hallway, was on the balcony of that penthouse 3 weeks later, during a gala I had been dressed for by a stylist who kept apologizing to my body like it had personally offended the dress. Cassia found me out there hiding from the noise, the specific overwhelm of a room full of people deciding, in real time, whether I belonged in it. "You left," she said. I needed air, and also to stop being looked at like a math problem someone couldn't solve. "You are a math problem," she said. "You're just one they can't afford to solve, so they've decided to be rude about it instead." She came to stand beside me at the railing, not close, exactly correct, the distance of someone who had thought carefully about distance. Priscilla again? Her, and a man who asked twice if I was new staff. Something in her face went dark and specific, the kind of dark that meant a name was being filed away for later use. You're not staff. I know what I am. Do you? She turned to look at me fully then, and the city light behind her turned her into something carved. Because, from where I'm standing, you walked into my company and found in 11 minutes what 6 accountants missed for 3 years. You correct venomous women at my dinner table without raising your voice. You pawned a family heirloom to save your brother's life and told me about it like it was the traffic report. Her voice dropped, not softer exactly. Lower. To register a command lives in right before it becomes something else. I don't think you know what you are at all. Tell me then. I meant it as a dare. She took it as an invitation, and the space between correct and close collapsed to nothing. Tell me to stop, she said, her hand coming up to rest, not grip, rest, against my jaw. And I will. Don't. I said, stop. She kissed me like she'd been rationing the idea of it for weeks and had finally run out of discipline. It was not soft. It was not rough either. It was exact. The way everything about her was exact, like she'd already run the calculation and simply needed the confirmation. When she pulled back, her scent had gone warm at the edges, sleet melting into something I would only ever smell on her again, in private, in rooms with no one else in them. That should not have felt like relief, she said, more to herself than to me. No, I agreed. It shouldn't have. Neither of us moved away. The board meeting where she was supposed to present my findings was still 4 days out. I did not know yet that Weston Hale had already found out I existed, had already begun building the story he would need to survive what I'd found, and that the story he chose to build would have my name written into it like a knife. I found out on a Thursday, the way you find out most disasters, sideways, mid-sentence, over a phone call that started ordinary. There's a board vote, Cassia said, no greeting, when she called me into the glass office at 8 in the morning. Her voice had none of the balcony in it. It had gone back to ledger cold, and for one terrible second I thought it was aimed at me. Weston's filed a formal complaint. He's alleging the audit is compromised, that you falsified the shell vendor findings to discredit him because you and I are, she stopped on the word. The first time I had ever seen her stop on a word involved, he's framing it as an omega manipulating an alpha executive's judgment for personal gain. He's asking the board to void the audit and open an investigation into you instead. That's insane. The numbers don't lie because I sleep in your bed. I know that. Her jaw was iron. The board doesn't care what's true. They care what's defensible in a press release. For 1 week, we did not touch each other in public, on her lawyer's advice, and I understood the necessity and hated it in equal measure, the way you can understand a splint is holding a bone straight and still feel every inch of the break underneath it. That was the week the storm hit. A real one. The kind the news calls historic, that knocked half the city's power out and stranded half the executive floor at the Callaway estate for a gala nobody could safely leave. It was also, with the particular cruelty of a body that keeps its own schedule regardless of a woman's plans, the week my heat came 3 days early, driven up by stress the way it sometimes is, catching me in a guest room with no suppressants and no way home through roads the storm had already closed. Cassia found me because I'd triggered the house's environmental alerts without meaning to. My scent, gone thick and sweet and unmistakable, tripped a system built to notify her of exactly one thing. She knocked before she opened the door. That detail matters more than almost anything else I can tell you about her. I can send Dana, she said, from the doorway, not crossing the threshold, her own scent gone rough at the edges with the effort of not doing what every instinct in her body was telling her to do. Or a suppressant courier, storm or no storm. I'll get one here. You don't have to stay, I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. Just stay, not, I don't mean. Just don't leave me alone in it. Marlowe, my name in that voice, was its own kind of anchor. Tell me exactly what you need, and tell me now, because in about 90 seconds I am not going to trust myself to ask twice. Stay by the door, I said. Talk to me. That's all. I mean it. That's all I'm asking. She stayed by the door. She talked to me for 6 hours about her father's ships, about the stars Eli loved, about nothing. About everything, her voice a rope I held onto through a night that would otherwise have swallowed me, and she did not cross the threshold once, though I watched her hand find the doorframe more than once like she needed something to grip that wasn't me. Near dawn, when the worst of it had broken, I said, "You could have." I know. She finally sat, on the floor just inside the door, exhausted in a way I had never seen her allow herself to be. That's not the kind of alpha I want to be for you. Not like that. Not first. What kind do you want to be? The kind you choose, she said, on a day when your body isn't choosing for you. I cried then, not from the heat, from something closer to the surface of everything I'd been holding. Eli's surgery, the brooch, Priscilla's smile, Weston's complaint, my mother's lemon cake arriving on a counter I hadn't earned yet, and Cassia didn't move to comfort me across a distance she'd decided mattered. She just kept talking, low and steady, until the sun came up over a storm-wrecked city and I fell asleep to the sound of her voice instead of the sound of my own fear. The board vote happened 2 days later, and it did not go the way either of us had let ourselves hope. Weston had built his case well, the way a man builds a case when he's had years of practice hiding one theft behind the accusation of another. He had photographs, Cassia and me on the balcony, the kiss, taken from an angle that made intimacy look like manipulation. He had a financial expert of his own paid to say my audit findings showed the marks of someone coached to falsify data. He had, worst of all, a version of Cassia's father's death that he told with just enough grief in his voice that half the room forgot he was the reason for it. The board isn't voting me out today, Cassia told me after, in a voice scraped down to its foundation. They're voting to suspend the audit, open an internal review, and require that I have no unsupervised financial contact with you until it's resolved. She would not look at me while she said it. I fought it. I lost the vote 9-4. So fight it publicly. I can't. Not without the very evidence Weston's called compromised. If I go to the press now with unverified findings, he wins the narrative even if he loses the money. Her hands, I noticed, were shaking. Minutely, the kind of shake a woman spends a lifetime learning to hide. I need you to disappear from the company files. Officially, today, you're firing me. I'm protecting the only proof we have. Her voice cracked on proof, just slightly, just once. I need you safe while I burn him down. I cannot do both at the same time, and I need you to trust that this is not the same thing as choosing him over you. I did not trust it, not in that moment, not with Priscilla's smile still fresh in my memory and my name now attached, in some boardroom's minutes, to the word compromised. I packed my bag in the guest room that had, for a handful of weeks, felt like the first safe room I'd ever lived in. I found the brooch in the bottom of my bag where I'd hidden it the day I refused to pawn it, and understood, with the flat certainty of someone doing math they didn't want to do, that Eli's next payment was due in 6 days and I had no income, no audit contract, and no company housing I was entitled to keep once I walked out that door. I pawned it again on my way to my old apartment, the one I hadn't given up the lease on, some instinct having warned me even in the good weeks not to burn every bridge behind me. I stood in the same shop, under the same buzzing fluorescent light, and watched the same man weigh the same garnet holly sprig, and I did not cry this time. I had used up that particular grief already, on a night in a doorway with a woman who wouldn't cross a threshold uninvited. Josie found me 3 days later, furious on my behalf in the specific loyal way only a best friend can manage. "She's not eating," Josie said, meaning her sister, sitting on my ancient couch like it might collapse under the weight of what she'd come to say. "She hasn't slept in the penthouse since you left it. Dana says she's rebuilt Weston's shell trail 4 separate times because she doesn't trust the version she has. Which, Marlo, that's not a woman who stopped caring. That's a woman who's terrified of losing the one piece of leverage she has left." The board thinks I falsified evidence. The board doesn't know you. Josie's eyes were wet. "I do. So does Dana, God help her. She likes you more than she's liked anyone I've ever brought home, and Dana doesn't like anyone." She took my hand. "Weston's making a mistake, and none of you can see it yet, because he thinks the only genius in this whole mess is him. He forgot you exist. That's the mistake. He built a smear campaign around a woman he assumes can't fight back." "I can't. I don't have access to the files anymore." Josie smiled, slow and a little vicious, a family trait I was only now recognizing across 2 different women who wore it 2 different ways. "You don't need the files. You have the pattern. You said it yourself. It's not new theft. It's old theft finishing itself. If it's old, there's a paper trail older than the one Weston scrubbed. Insurance filings from the year Cassia's father died. Public record. You don't need Callaway Holdings' permission to read a public filing." I looked at my hands. I thought about 11 minutes with a spreadsheet, the cold shock climbing my teeth. The one true thing about me that had never once, in 24 years, needed anyone's permission to be real. "Get me a laptop," I said, "and every hour Dana can spare, and something to write on that isn't the back of a pawnshop receipt." It took 4 days and a cot in Josie's spare room, and more coffee than any human body should metabolize. But I found it, the original insurance claim from the year Warren Callaway's company collapsed, filed under a policy number that, cross-referenced against the shell vendor's founding date, put Weston Hale's signature on a document 11 months before he claimed, publicly, under oath, to have had any relationship with that vendor at all. It was not new theft dressed up as old. It was the same theft, worn thin and repainted, the same hand on the same knife, 12 years apart. "He didn't just steal from the company," I told Cassia, when Dana finally got me 5 unsupervised minutes with her in a parking garage that smelled like concrete and rain, because that was the only place Weston's people weren't watching. "He killed your father's company on purpose, and then he spent 12 years stealing from the wreckage he made, and he's been doing it in your building, under your name, the entire time you thought you were protecting his legacy." Cassia did not speak for a long moment. Her scent, in that concrete garage, went past sleet into something colder and stiller, the particular quiet of a woman deciding exactly how much of herself she was willing to spend to finish this. "The annual shareholders meeting is in 6 days, she said finally. "Public, recorded, every board member who voted against you will be in that room, and so will every reporter Weston's been feeding his version to." She looked at me, and for the first time since the boardroom, something in her face allowed itself to hope. "Can you stand in front of all of them and say what you just said to me?" I stood in front of a table full of people who called me a stray and corrected the record without raising my voice, I said. "I can do it again in a room that costs more." She almost smiled. It was the first almost smile I'd seen from her in 11 days, and I felt it land somewhere under my ribs like something coming back online. "There's one more thing," she said, quieter. "Weston knows I won't let anything happen to you. That's the leverage he thinks he has left. If he sees the room turning, he may not go quietly." her jaw set. "If it comes to it, I need you to trust that I will put myself between you and whatever he does. And I need you to promise me something in return. Anything. If I go too far, if I stop being the alpha who waits by a doorframe and start being the kind who doesn't, you stop me. Not because I'll thank you for it in the moment, because I need to know, walking into that room, that there is one person in the world who will pull me back from the edge instead of cheering me over it." "I promise," I said, and meant it with my whole chest, and did not yet know how soon I would have to keep it. The shareholders' meeting was held in a hall with a ceiling 3 stories high and 140 people in it who had, at some point over the last 2 weeks, decided they knew exactly who I was. Priscilla Vane sat in the second row in a dress the color of a bruise, smiling the way she'd smiled at that first dinner, sweet poison, sure of her own aim. Weston Hale spoke first. He was good at it, smooth, aggrieved, a man in a gray suit performing the specific innocence of someone who has practiced looking wronged in a mirror. He called the audit a fabrication. He called me an opportunist. He used the word omega, like it was itself a piece of evidence, and I watched half the room nod along like he'd said something true instead of something old. Cassia let him finish. That was, I would learn, the most dangerous thing about her. She let people finish digging before she showed them the hole was already 6 feet deep. "Ms. Vance," she said, when he sat down, "will present the complete findings." I stood. My hands did not shake, which surprised me more than anyone in that room. I put the insurance filing on the screen behind me, the one with Weston's signature on it. Dated 11 months before his sworn testimony said it should exist. "Mr. Hale told this board the shell vendor is new," I said. "It isn't. It's 12 years old. It was opened the same fiscal quarter Warren Calloway's company collapsed, under a policy he personally signed, using an insurance payout that should have gone to the employees his company laid off, and instead went into an account that has been quietly feeding itself out of Callaway Holdings ever since, 3% at a time. Small enough that no one thought to ask why the rounding never quite added up. I let that sit. I didn't fabricate a pattern to hurt Mr. Hale. I found the same pattern he's been running since before I was old enough to do the math that would eventually catch him. The room, which had been a low hum of skepticism, went very, very quiet. Weston stood too fast. "This is a fantasy built by a woman sleeping her way into. Sit down," Cassia said, and her voice did not rise, and the room obeyed her before he did. "You signed a document 11 months before you claim the relationship existed. That is not a fantasy. That is a date, Weston, and dates don't sleep with anyone." He lunged, not at her, at the projector, at the evidence, some animal instinct toward destroying the thing that was ending him, and Cassia was between us before I had finished flinching, her body a wall, her hand catching his wrist mid-air with a grip I felt more than saw, absolute and immovable. "You've done enough damage to this family," she said, very quietly. Quiet enough that only the front rows, and I could hear it, quiet enough that it landed louder than shouting would have. "You are not going to touch what's left of it." Security had him by the shoulders within seconds. I watched something in Cassia's face go past fury into a place I recognized from the concrete garage, a stillness that meant she was one more provocation from becoming something she'd promised me she didn't want to be. "Cassia," I said her name, not loud, just enough. "That's enough. Let them take him. You don't have to be the one who finishes this." She looked at me. Something in her shoulders came down an inch, then 2. "Get him out of my building," she told security, and stepped back, and the room exhaled as one body. The board vote to reinstate the audit and remove Weston Hale from every position he'd ever held passed unanimously, 9-0. The same 9 who had voted against me 2 weeks earlier, now unable to meet my eyes. Priscilla Vane left before the vote finished, her bruise-colored dress swallowed by the crowd, and I never saw her at another Callaway event again. That night, Cassia found me on the same balcony where she'd first kissed me, the city glittering underneath us like it hadn't just watched a man's 12-year theft collapse in real time. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to know you can tell me to stop, and I will, at any point, for any reason, and it will not change anything about how I feel about you." "Ask." "Bond with me." Her voice, for the first time in the whole story I am telling you, shook. "Not tonight. Tonight isn't for that. Tonight is just for you. Whatever you need it to be. But I have spent 6 years being told love is leverage, and control is the only safe way to survive loving anyone, and you walked into my hallway, drunk and honest and correcting my worst enemies without raising your voice, and I have not stopped wanting to be the kind of alpha you'd choose since. Tell me if that's too much. Tell me to stop." "Don't," I said, the same word I'd said on this same balcony weeks earlier, meaning the opposite of what it sounded like it meant. "Don't stop. Not this time. Not any time." The claiming, when it came slow and asked for at every step, her mouth at my throat, pausing, waiting, my own voice saying yes into the dark before her teeth ever did, the bite landing like a door finally opening instead of one being forced, and the bond snapped into place between us like something that had always been half-built and was only now finished. Her scent flooded warm for the first time since I'd met her, sleet gone fully to rain, clove smoke gone sweet at the edges, and mine answered it, fig and warm linen filling a room built for 2 people who had both spent their whole lives being told love was a liability. "That answer should not have felt like relief," I said, echoing her, months later than the words deserved. "No," she agreed, against my hair. "It shouldn't have." Neither of us moved away. The proposal came 6 months after that, on a morning with the particular gold light that only exists for about 11 minutes in early autumn, in the kitchen of the apartment I had cried in over a dishwasher a lifetime ago. Cassia actually knelt, the winter ledger, on her own kitchen floor, in sweatpants, with no cameras and no board members and no reason at all, except that she wanted to, and opened a small box that held, not a diamond, but my grandmother's garnet holly brooch, redeemed from the pawnshop the same week Weston Hale's trial began, cleaned and reset onto a slim gold pin. "You keep giving pieces of yourself away to save the people you love," she said. I wanted to be the one who gave a piece back, for once, and asked for nothing except everything, for the rest of both our lives. "That's not nothing," I said, laughing through the specific kind of crying that ruins your voice. I know. She was crying too, which I would not have believed possible 6 months earlier, in a hallway that now felt like it belonged to someone else's story. "Marry me anyway." I said yes before I'd finished deciding to. By then, it had become something of a habit. Eli's surgery happened the following spring, fully funded, fully successful, and he stood at our wedding 4 months later in a suit Keziah had insisted on paying for, and Eli had insisted, loudly, on choosing the tie for himself, a small blue one covered in stars. Because some things about a person do not change even when everything else around them finally does. Dana, gruff to the last, handed me a small wrapped box before the ceremony that turned out to hold a set of engraved tools for the bakery's books, the driest gift giver in Callaway Holdings admitting, in her own language, that she had never once in 15 years seen Cassia wait for anyone the way she'd waited for me. Mrs. Pruitt. The housekeeper who'd fed me lemon cake and gossip in equal measure through every hard week of that year cried harder than either of the brides and told anyone who'd listened that she'd known, the very first morning, watching Cassia guard a doorway all night instead of crossing it, exactly how the story was going to end. Weston Hale was sentenced that autumn to 11 years for fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction, the same courtroom where 12 years earlier he had stood and lied about a dead man's numbers and no one had thought to check his math. This time, someone had. A year on, Kasaya and I stood on that same balcony at dawn, not the gala balcony. Our balcony, the one attached to the home we'd chosen together, smaller than the penthouse and infinitely warmer for it, and watched the gold light climb over a city that no longer felt too big to belong in. The garnet brooch caught the light on my collar, holly-shaped, small, redeemed. She wrapped her arms around me from behind the way she had never quite managed in that first careful month. No distance measured out between correct and close anymore. Just the two of us and a window and one small object that had traveled from a pawnshop counter to a proposal box to this exact morning, without ever once stopping being what it always was. Proof that some things, however many times they get given away, were always meant to find their way home. It is a strange thing to spend your whole life invisible and then be seen so completely it rewrites what you thought your own name meant. I had believed for 24 years that being quiet was the price of being safe. Cassia Calloway taught me, in a hallway and a doorway and a boardroom and a bond, that being seen was not a danger to survive. It was simply the thing I had been waiting for, without knowing I was allowed to wait for it at all. The end.